All right, well, welcome back, everyone. Today we're going to be getting back into the second part, or the latter part of Second Samuel. And man, quite some interesting stories. We could go over this for weeks and weeks. There's so much in here, but I guess where we're picking up is at the end. Of course, David has had one of his best men murdered, and has taken his wife, and they have she gives birth to the child, and the child dies, and David repents, and here we are. So the first story that kind of comes up here is David's David's son Amnon, and the rape of Tamar. So what we see here, what happens. So I guess many of us. I mean, the thing about these stories that they're just as relevant today. The human condition and the human nature is the same back then as it was now. And I guess what stuck out to me in this was that David has some of his kids that go pretty bad. He'd lost credibility and he lost authority.
He did.
For what he had done. It's like my dad. Growing up, my dad used to smoke. And he would always say to us, the kids, like, whatever you do, don't smoke, you're going to be in trouble. Didn't carry a lot of weight.
Right. Until he did quit smoking.
Until he did.
Yeah.
And he did. And that's another miracle. But the point is, and I'm not picking on my dad, but David had how could he correct his children any longer after what he had done had become public? What he had done with Tamar, and what he had done with his friend and loyal, one of the few men that stuck with him in the hard times, Uriah, had him murdered and took his wife. Did he have a lot of credibility with his family after that?
I think he didn't, but I think one of the things that he failed to do there was he failed to say, even though I have done all of these things wrong and I have lost some credibility, I still know what's right, and I'm still going to tell you to do the right thing, even though I've done the wrong thing. He just never rose up to be a good father. And that was a failure, I think, on the part of David. Because, we all make mistakes, and we all do bad things, and not as bad as David did with Bathsheba. But he never... It doesn't feel in the Bible like he attempted to regain his position. Because the Lord didn't take that position away from him. He still had that position, and yet he never rose to the occasion.
It seems from this point out that David is kind of a shell of himself. That something was lost of his, I don't know if it was his youth or vigor or vitality, but he's just not that zealous, incredibly strong character that we see before that. There was a lot of lessons I think David learned from that. Yeah. And all of those things coming out publicly, I mean, it would be very embarrassing.
Yeah.
And it's easy for us to be hard on David here, but how would you like it if all of our sins were written down in a book for generations to see, and not only that, but for eternity?
Oh yeah.
It's quite
I think the other thing about that story is that his son Amnon really, really wanted something, and unfortunately that was his half-sister. And when he finally got what he wanted, he despised her. And I think so often with people, they think they want something, and it's not something good for them, and it's not something right and pure. And once they get it, it just tastes bad. It feels bad. There's a reason that you don't always get your heart's desires.
Yeah, and I think it kind of goes back to, that's why God had so much to say, especially in the New Testament, about it's hard for the rich man to enter into the kingdom of God. And he's not saying that anyone who's wealthy or has money is not going to be in the kingdom. He's saying it's hard, but then he follows it up. What's so important is, but all things are possible with God. And what he tells us, oftentimes when we see these, we've all seen kids that were raised in families of privilege, they go off the rails. If they've never wanted for anything or never had to work for anything. And as I imagine, as the king's son, and he was probably used to having anything that he wanted.
Yeah.
And we have King David, which is no longer has the moral high ground and doesn't really have the ability anymore to straighten out his children and tell them what they should or should not do because of the things that he has done. And of course, and this is a kind of a manifestation of that sense of entitlement that is so prevalent. And David losing the ability to be that bulwark against those things.
And also first of all, his son rapes his half sister. Then the other brother kills the brother in revenge. Then he has to flee. And I mean, it perpetuates bad act after bad act after bad act. And it's just tragic.
Yeah, and when you say that, it goes back to so many things. I hear all the time. Well, what do you care what I do? It only affects me. It's not a crime against what I'm doing. Is not a crime against civilization or against my community. You know, if I decide to engage in illicit drug use, or if I engage to have an affair with my neighbor's wife, it doesn't affect you. So it's none of your business. And why do you care? But ultimately, what we see here is it does affect. The decisions that we make and the things that we do have repercussions on our children, on the people that we're around. And that's why God takes such a dim view of his ministers. I mean, we talk about this every time. The ones that he's called on to be teachers, why he takes such a dim view of them falling into sin, because it takes away their credibility. It takes away their authority. If they are a prophet, especially when we see in the Old Testament, one of the people that hell is reserved for is for Satan and for the false prophet, and for the person claiming to speak for God, teaching lies. It is to God, it seems to me, much more grievous than the sin of someone who is not proclaimed or a teacher of God's words. That was kind of interesting. So we have Absalom returns.
Yeah, so he flees, and Joab convinces King David via this woman coming in and kind of telling him a story that Absalom should return. Even though he does return, David doesn't see him. I believe it's for 2 years.
Yeah, and to stay on Absalom, I mean, this was very premeditated. He had been conniving and planning this for years and years. He laid this trap for his brother. And he knew that he was buying his time, and finally they all go out to a party. He kind of orchestrates this, and then he kills his brother, and all of the children come back to and David finally gets the news that what has happened.
Yeah. And
Absalom knows that David will not let that stand, and he doesn't come home, and he flees. Well, he's been gone a while, and as the case is, when you those things kind of get soothed out over time a little bit, he starts inquiring and wants an audience with his dad. He wants to come home. But David's not hearing him, not listening to him. And so I gather from the story that he's also reaching out to David's right hand, which is Joab, trying to get Joab, hey, can you talk to my dad? Right,
because he's at home at that point.
Right.
But David refuses to see him still.
Oh, that's right. He had come back, but David refused to see him. So he's trying to get an audience with his dad. Joab's not returning his emails. And so what does Absalom do? He's like, okay, I gotta make a statement here. I gotta get someone's attention. What's he do?
He sets his fields afire.
Sets his fields on fire.
And that's a big thing in that day and age.
That's a big
thing nowadays, but it's really a livelihood.
Yeah,
it's not just
it would have been
money in the bank. It's
burning down your home and your business and cleaning out your bank account. Everything. It was a bad. Anyway, so he got Joab's attention, and then what happens from there?
Well, then David sees him.
So David sees him, and then of course the family is reunited, but not all is well.
No, because Absalom continues to connive and decides, well, everyone who's going to go and see David, I'm going to talk to them before they go and see David, and I'm going to tell them how I would rule in their favor, and I'm going to convince them that they should love me more than David. So
we see here Absalom is a very much a plotting, calculating character,
right.
a real chess player. So he makes sometime after this, he makes a decision that he wants to take over David's kingdom, and he goes about it very subtly. He doesn't come out boldly and raise an army and try to challenge David, but he tries to manipulate the people.
Right.
He tries to win the hearts of the people, and we definitely start to see it kind of points to David's decline. I don't know if he's getting old and he's getting tired and not really paying attention to what's going on. But Absalom, what's he do? He goes out and he sits outside the gates, and it was in the custom in those days that people would come when they wanted justice, that the king would judge between them. So if they had a dispute over a cow or a land property deal or something, they would come to the city, and they would ask to have an audience with David, and David would settle. So David, apparently, I don't know if he didn't have time or if just Absalom was just straight up lying about it, was intercepting these people at the gate and saying, I'm the king's son, and tell me what is your grievance. And he's listening very earnestly and nodding his head. You can picture the whole thing, and says, boy, you have a good case here. We wouldn't be wasting the king's time here. I'm paraphrasing, but it's too bad that the king doesn't have time to fool with you. He can't be bothered. But boy,
and even those that went there, well, your son said I should have won. How come you're ruling against me, David?
Yeah, if I were king,
single person who went through, he said, you should win, you should win, you should win. I mean, you get that feeling that no matter what it was, of course you should win. I'm on your side. Every single person.
The perfect politician.
Perfect politician.
Same thing we have today. He's kissing babies and holding hands, and so he's slowly, the word's getting out that the king, he doesn't care about our needs, but Absalom. Well, I'll tell you, Absalom, not only he's a handsome looking guy, isn't he? And boy, how humble is he? When we went and bowed before him and addressed him as king, what did he pick this up? Said, no, I'm just like you. Just a common man like you.
So what does this tell us about God's character? Like, that's the bigger question, right? Can God be trusted? Or is this just telling us what's happening?
It's telling us what's happening.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a lot of it. The thing is, like we were talking about earlier, that in all these wives and concubines, we also hear there in the chapter. It's easy to make the mistake, as we were listening to Graham today, and he made the point of just because it's written in this book, just because it's what David did, the very small view or the short-sighted view would be to say, okay, I'm going to line up my key text here. David is a man after God's own heart, and David was a murderer and an adulterer, and he had wives and concubines, had a harem.
Had lots of blood on his hands.
And so, if that's what it means to be a man after God's own heart, then I'm going to do all those things. I'm gonna go get myself some multiple wives, and I'm going to kill my enemies, and I'm going to steal my best friend's wife, because I want to be a man after God's own heart as well.
Right.
I think the heart racer wants in. So, is that what it means to be a man after God's own heart, to do all the things does that mean that God condoned everything that David did?
No. And so I think it's important to point out, because our broader question is, can God be trusted, and what does this show us about God's character? Just because it's in the Bible doesn't mean that God is approving of it.
I think it's really important to go back to the point when the children of Israel were coming into the promised land. And what did God tell them? God told them that you don't need to fight. If you trust me, and if you do it like I told you to do, I'll send the angels before me. They will clear out the land. I'll send the hornets. I'll send swarms of bees forward to clean out the lands. He didn't want his people to have to engage in this hand-to-hand combat and slaughter all these people to inhabit the land. He was going to do that for them, but they wouldn't have it.
Right. So now this is, as we continue through 2 Samuel, we see that there's repercussions not just for David's behavior, but also for King Saul's behavior with the Gibeonites later on towards the end of 2 Samuel. And it's, there's consequences. There's consequences for our behavior and other people's behavior too.
There is consequences. And I think that all of these bloody stories and it's such a short-sighted view, what I'm starting to see here as we read through here, for someone to say, look at the God of the Old Testament, look what a bloodthirsty monster he was. But when we go back and we look at the whole picture, it was never God's plan for David to have to be a man of war.
Right.
But that's where they were at. And even though it wasn't ideal, God was still willing to work with him. No, he didn't want to give them the strength to go and to destroy and have to kill all of those people, but that's where they were. When he gave them a king, would they have listened to a man that showed up like Jesus at the time that was preaching turn the other cheek?
No.
They didn't know anything. All they knew was war and battle and dominating your fellow man by sheer brute force. And I guess the thing about it that speaks to me is that God never ordered them to do that, and He had a better way. But even though they turned away from Him, God could have said, "Well, they didn't do it my way. If that's the way they want it, I'll leave them to their own devices and leave it to the Philistines, and they'll teach them a lesson. They'll completely wipe them off the earth."
Right.
It would be the equivalent would be to if you had a child that got in trouble, became addicted to drug, heroin addict or something like that. And when you hear about this and you know that he's living in a flop house somewhere, you say, well, that's not the ideal. He didn't do what I told him to do, so he's going to have to take care of himself.
Yeah.
Do we not try to find our son? And let's say that, and buy him some food or give him some clothing or help him to stay in an environment, at least so he's got something to eat. Is that flop house ideal?
No.
So, but are we still willing as loving parents to make the best of that situation and continue to help them?
Yeah.
And that's what God is doing. Israel, it has got itself in a predicament, in a situation that God never ordained. But God is such a loving Father that He's still helping them out. He's still working through this. And even in the whole time doing it, running a great risk of making Himself look angry, arbitrary, and severe.
That's true.
It's incredible. I mean,
so we're back.
So I get off on my tangents here. So where are we at here?
Well, so Absalom, he ends up taking the kingdom from David, and David flees.
Yeah, and so Absalom comes in and he devises this plan and takes over, and David and the remaining people that are faithful to him leaves, and they basically take off.
Right.
And I've often wondered when I read this, did he make the decision to do that? Did he give up so easily so he didn't have to harm his son? Was he willing to forfeit his livelihood, forfeit his kingdom, knowing that if it came to blows, if it came that the two armies would come together, there's a chance that Absalom would lose? Being a man of very little experience, a young man didn't have experience in leading armies. David was a proven battle warrior. His soldiers were, the mighty men of renown. I wonder if he left just so it wouldn't come to this.
Yeah.
Have you ever considered that when you read it?
Yeah. Well, and I think too for David, one of the things that was always so important is he never wanted to hurt somebody. He always wanted, like he talked about being Saul being God's anointed, and he had the option to kill. And he knew that he had been anointed as well, and that he was supposed to be in that position. I guess I don't know.
So Absalom takes over the kingdom, and when David left, he'd left many of his wives or concubines. Were they
10 of them?
10 of his concubines
to watch over everything.
Watch over things. And so Absalom does something very despicable. He has sexual relations with his father's own concubines publicly.
Yeah.
As a show
saying, I'm here now.
A show of his authority.
David is gone. I'm here now.
This is something that you start to see what his relationship was with God. This was something that was strictly forbidden, very severely looked down upon in the Old Testament. That was something that was never to be done.
Right.
And he does it he doesn't do it privately. He does it publicly. It is he does it right in God's face.
Yeah.
This is intentionally directed at God, and it's showing Absalom's disdain for God's commandments and for his father. So this takes place, and so there was a wise counselor. I thought this story was interesting. What was his name?
Well, he had two counselors, and so one of them went with Absalom, Ahithophel, and David realized that he was back there and didn't trust him, so he sent Hushai.
Yeah, Hushai.
Back, and so Absalom gets information for Ahithophel saying, take 12,000 men, go after David. He's weary. You can get him now. And Absalom calls in Hushai and says, well, what do you think? And Hushai's like, that's really smart. But that's not what he says to Absalom. Mm-hmm, to Absalom, he says, no, I probably wouldn't do that.
He boosts his ego.
Right. Right.
Is what he's essentially doing here.
But he also ends up sending spies to David to say, David, this is what's going on. So he's David's insider inside of Absalom's.
So David was no fool here.
Right.
So we have so David is fleeing.
Right.
And so Absalom gathers together his trusted men and leaders, and they're going to have a war party here. They're going to find out what they should do.
Yeah.
So it says here that Ahithophel, sorry if I'm mispronouncing that his counsel was like the oracles of God. So reliable was his counsel that he was almost like a prophet. So this guy comes up to Absalom, and Absalom says, what do you think I should do? And he says, you know what? We've got momentum on our side. The men are fleeing. They just crossed the brook. If we send these men now, we can cut them down. You'll be rid of your enemy. But we need to move quickly. Well, David, he was no fool either, had his own man there in the council and sent him instructions. And so Hushai came and he didn't say, well, Ahithophel's counsel is no good, because no one would have believed that. He had such a track record of being so wise. He said, Ahithophel, what he says is good, but this might be better. I mean, he's not discounting it.
Yeah.
He's not automatically turning everyone against him. He appeals to Absalom's pride and says, he says, wouldn't it be way cooler if we could? Those men, they're going to be angry. They're going to be like an injured lion or injured bear or a lion. You know how that can be. These are mighty men of war. Let's do this. Let's sit back from this a little bit and let's raise a great big army and let's put you on the front. You can ride in on your charger and you can be the man. You could personally go and vanquish the enemy, and you will, because Absalom couldn't leave at that point. I mean, his hold on the crown was tenuous at best. He had to kind of hang around, make sure everything got taken care of, and this appealed to him.
Yeah,
he thought this sounded pretty good, and the reason why Hushai made this recommendation was to give David time.
Yeah,
David needed time to get away.
David was wary.
So, then we have a battle.
Yep, the troops go out.
The troops go out.
And David's troops convince him to stay home. That he's going out for his son. I don't know if they felt we left because David wasn't commanding well. If we go out under David's command and he sees his son is there, he's not going to let us kill his son. He's not going to command well again.
So you think they had an ulterior motive?
Oh yeah, I think
they wanted to go out and do what they knew needed to be done that David would never sanction.
Yeah,
but they didn't tell David that.
No.
They couched it as, well, you're the king, and if it comes down to it, if we find that our army is defeated, you as a ransom, it might make the difference between all of our families being saved. You're worth more to us
alive than dead.
Than a dead commander.
Right.
And of course, we have the story that the battle turns bad for Absalom and his men. And as he's fleeing, riding his mule, I believe it is, his hair is caught in what type of a tree was it? The mulberry tree, or?
Well, and they were talking about before with his hair and he sounded like a really vain guy, and
he was the Fabio of
and
Jerusalem.
Vanity got him.
And so he is hung and he goes under a low-hanging branch and his hair catches, and there he is suspended, as the old King James puts it, between heaven and earth.
Yeah.
And Joab's men fall upon him and kill him.
Right. And David mourns, and he is mourning and weeping and mourning and weeping, and Joab and all of David's men are coming back into town. And Joab has some pretty harsh words for David. He says, you know what? You sent us out to do a job. Today should be a day of rejoicing. And you are not even, you're thanking those who hate you instead of thanking those who worked on your side. You love those who hate you, and you hate those who love you. And he essentially said, you get your act together, David. These are your men. Go out and thank them for the job they did.
It was to defeat a victory in battle back in those days. It was a great cause of celebration. What that meant was our God is with us. There was no sorrow or rejoicing. That was something that was wonderful. And so all of these men that are coming back that had been exiled. Looks like Miss Pants is coming in too.
Sorry.
David's army and his people that had been exiled, now they're returning home triumphant, back to their homes and their loved ones and all of their things. And here we have the king crying in the tower of the gate, lamenting and crying, "Oh, Absalom, Absalom,
Right.
my son, I loved you so much."
Right.
It's heartbreaking.
It is heartbreaking that you're.
Sorry, we started. The camera shuts off at 30.
And then really wondering, did the Lord bring him to me? I better not take this chance.
And here,
in the event that it's not.
And here he is again. Look how he's behaving towards his son, who had despised him and chased him from Jerusalem and taken his own concubines and basically thrown him off of his throne. Look at the forgiveness personified. And those tears that he cries, "Oh, my son, Absalom." How it is. I think it is a foreshadowing of the pain that God will go through of his very own children that never turned to him, that never came to him in prayer, that never accepted his sacrifice of his son. I think that God will weep over those lost children as well.
Yeah.
There is those that would say that would paint God in a light that he enjoys torturing his own children in the flames of hell. That he enjoys all of those who wouldn't come to. But that's not the case.
No.
We see so many parallels in the story of David weeping over his son. I think it's not unlike God weeping over his lost children as well.
Yeah.
So Joab gives him a good talking to, so
then we have Sheba the Benjamite who rebels.
Sheba the Benjamite who rebels.
And I thought it was interesting that so Joab pursues him, and they get to the town, and one of the wise old women comes out and say, "Hey, we don't want the whole town to be going. What do you want?" And they say, "We want Sheba's head." So cut off his head and throw it over the wall. I mean, it was very
let's be very practical.
Very practical.
And I think that only could have happened through a woman.
Why?
Well, I think the men were. I mean, you dig your heels in, and you have the ego and the pride and all these things going on, and sometimes you can't see around that. Okay, you want a battle? We'll give you a battle, even though it's going to cost everything that we have, and there's a good chance that we'll even lose our lives. And there's a woman thinking, well, you know what? There's a better way.
Yeah.
I think we can come up with a solution where none of this is going to have to happen. It's going to be better for everyone.
And I wonder too if they thought, life was pretty good under David. Like, do we really want this Sheba guy?
Yeah, how far are we willing to take this?
Yeah.
We're willing to take it until there's an army camped outside of our...
Right, and there might be a lot of people who are going to die, and I'm not going to be one of them.
Yeah. So,
then there's a famine.
There's the famine. David's hot water bottle.
You skipped a whole bunch.
Should we go back to that?
Well, I think it's interesting to note that there's a famine in Israel for 3 years. And the reason is because of something King Saul did long, long ago. That they had promised to protect the Gibeonites, but they didn't. And so this is David's reign. Like, Saul is gone, and yet there are repercussions for Saul's actions still. And that we, like, to this day, see repercussions of our forefathers, and people will have to have repercussions from our actions now, and sometimes we forget that, but it's seen very
and God doesn't forget that, and that's the important. I think that this also really speaks to the character of God in that how easy for us, we don't really take our word and oaths and things we say to heart many times.
Yeah.
I mean, we may promise our neighbor who wants to help some help. Oh yeah, I'll come over there and do that, and I'll help you with this, and this neighbor may be counting on that, and how we justify not doing that. Maybe we think to ourselves, oh, if I had known really how busy I was going to be, I never would have promised that. And
on that note, we're going to our neighbors on Sunday.
Yeah. Well, we don't want to be those people. But the point, when you say, these promises that we make, do we not
Right.
always kind of try to wiggle out of them, and just because maybe if our friend or neighbor is gracious enough not to bring it up to us and hold it to us, we think that, well, it wasn't really that important. But when God makes a promise, and especially when his ministers make promises in his name, those need to be honored.
Right.
Because God's not like us that we should lie, that he should lie, and that when God says something and makes a promise to it, we can absolutely stand on it, and he doesn't waffle, he doesn't use situational ethics, and he doesn't try to justify reasons why we could get out of the things that we don't want to do.
Yeah. So there's been a famine in Israel for 3 years. Because of this from King Saul. So David says, hey, Gibeonites, what's it going to take to fix this? And it's harsh. It's really harsh. So they ask for 7 of Saul's sons.
Yeah.
And grandsons. And, yeah.
And so this is a heavy price. And David's got to go pry these sons from their mothers and give them over to these enemies. Or these other men, and they string him up.
And what do you think about the fact that he does not take Jonathan's son?
Well, we all have our favorites, don't we?
Yeah.
That's the way the world works. But he had also made a promise, not only to Saul, but to Jonathan, to look after their descendants.
Yeah.
And so he was bound. He was in a tight spot there.
Right.
He was bound by the promise that God's minister at the time that Saul had made to these people, but he had also made an oath to Jonathan and to Saul. Remember when Saul was in the cave?
Yeah.
And Saul said, "Oh, you're a better man than I am. I want you to promise me that you will not destroy my descendants." But so what was David to do with this? And he promised.
Right.
But when it comes down to it,
but Saul made a promise, and he had to fulfill Saul's right. Yeah.
He had to go. Which one do you keep? Do you keep the promise that God made, or do you make the promise that he made? And should he have made an oath, and should he have made a promise without consulting God? But it's easy for us to say. I mean, because it'd be one thing. David had we know back in there that the priests of God had the Urim and the Thummim?
Yeah.
These 2 stones on the ephod that God's prophet or the speaker could go before God and get an answer. I don't know if they said yes or no, up or down. I don't know what they said, but they could essentially go in and when Saul murdered all of the priests, one escaped and came to David, and he brought with him that priestly vestule. And David was inquiring to God about this. And so David didn't have quite the excuse. I'm trying to justify us, because we can say, okay, well, I need to make a decision. Should I buy this home, or should I take this job, or should I marry this woman? And so, okay, well, people say, well-intentioned people say, go take it to God. And you take it to God, and maybe it's 6 months, maybe it's a year, and you haven't heard anything. So what are you supposed to do?
Oftentimes we make our own decision.
Did not is that not the same thing that happened with
yes.
Who comes to mind?
Sarah.
With Sarah.
Yeah.
So don't be too hard on ourselves. I guess what I'm saying is that here you have Abraham that spoke directly to God, and then you have David, who had the luxury of he could. Should I go up and should I go?
He's got his own Gad's his own prophet, right?
Yeah, he's got a direct line. He's got a direct line, and he can get his questions answered. And he even. And how about the prophet? Was it Nathan? Who was it? Nathan that said?
Yeah, Nathan said to him, "Yeah, you can go ahead and build.
Go ahead, David.
Build the temple.
Go ahead and build that temple." And then God comes in at night and says, "Nathan, I never told you to tell David to do that."
Let's talk about that first.
So we have these examples of these are God's own people, the ones that have the direct connection, and they're making decisions and not going to him. So what do you not wish sometimes that do you wish that I had one of those, that when you had a decision I could go in the closet and come back out and say, Yeah, guys.
Yeah.
Would I not come out with great authority?
Yes, you would.
But is there freedom in that? Is that, or is that a servant being told what to do? Would you be willing to give up your freedom to make decisions? And I don't believe that there is only one path, that we come to these crossroads, we come to these forks in our life, and God would wish us to go one way, and He would wish us not to go the other way. And we have to, every day, every hour, every second, we have to make these decisions, and either we're in and out of God's will all the time. I mean, if I thought, if that was true, that would be a miserable existence.
Yeah.
What happens if you die when you are down the wrong fork? So if you go this way, is God not with you that day until you come to the other one and veer back to the one that God will be with you on the same? I mean, what kind of existence would that be?
Yeah, that doesn't sound like a loving God to me.
That
not one that I would want to serve.
That would be no way to live.
Right.
And that a servant is told what to do. A servant goes in and gets his orders from God and does what he's told, and doesn't have any latitude or any free will to do what he wants to do.
Speaking of that, towards the end, when David commands a census, Joab objects and says, no, we've done the census before, we're not doing a census again. It's a bad thing. And David says, we're doing a census.
So why was that such a big deal? Why was God so angry about David counting
the
people?
But here's the thing to me is that Joab goes ahead and does it, even though he knows it's wrong. So, like, is he... I mean, he even knows it's wrong, and he says no.
He's a soldier following orders, though. He is a military man, and that's what military men do. If the President of the United States says to the Commander-in-Chief, do this, he does that.
Yeah, but would it not be better for him to say, you know what, the Lord actually wants me to do the right thing?
If he wants to lose his position and be court-martialed.
Well, that's more important than...
imprisoned.
That's more important than...
Well, I mean, that...
Would you rather do what the President wants or the Lord wants?
Well, there may be men of that strong a conviction, but not very many. And Joab was no... he was
no angel.
Saint. Yeah. No angel. But the interesting thing about, at least he seemed to have better sense on this decision than David did.
Well, yeah, and I appreciate the fact that he was willing to go to David and say, he rebuked him before, get up, go talk to your men. He says to him now, no census.
I think it was quite a bold thing for Joab to say that to David, because if we look back a little bit, Joab was afraid of David.
Right.
I mean,
but he did go to him and say, you should bring Absalom home. Like, I mean, he certainly was willing to go to David and say his things.
After the fire. I mean, but not before that.
Actually before that. He's the one who got the woman to come in and talk to him and get him Absalom back to the kingdom.
But I was thinking back at Uriah, you know, when he put, even though he was acting on David's orders and he'd sent Uriah up to the heat of the battle so that he was killed by the enemy, he was concerned of what David was going to say, and so he had that little scheme, be careful how you say this, and give him the good news first. So he was feeling that he didn't know how David was going to respond, even though David had given him a direct written order to do this, and he had followed his orders. He was concerned that there was going to be blowback on him. So
he was going to be the scapegoat.
Yeah, and Job was there when these men had, maybe he didn't know David very well. Because Joab was there when these men came and thought they would curry favor with David by bringing the things of Saul's crown and such, and he saw what David had done to these men. Yeah. And maybe Joab was watching that thinking, "Whoa, David's going to really reward them." Who knows? I think that David probably was unpredictable. I don't know. We're speculating. We're almost out of time. Let's finish up with David's hot water bottle.
Oh, I was going to... Really? What about David's last census consequence?
Yeah.
3 days of plague, 70,000 dead.
Yeah, that is... We'll skip the hot water bottle and go with that because that's important. So, what does it say about God that David made this decision and 70,000 people are punished for something that they didn't do?
I think it speaks to the point, again, where we are given a job, where we take on a responsibility, that we need to think about them, and we need to do them. I mean, here again, it's vanity. That's the reason he wants a census, to say, how many people do I have under me?
We don't know exactly what, but I think you're right. I think we can speculate
Yeah.
that
He also may want to,
David wants to see how big of an army can I raise.
yeah, especially because there's been so many fractions here and there, and finally they're reunited. So he's like, okay, so we're finally back together.
So by taking a census, it's always seemed to me that David was not putting his faith in God to bring them through any type of a military action that needed to
Right.
they needed to be engaged in, and was going to how he was going to determine whether he was powerful or strong enough to go and to do the things, the conquest that he wanted to do based on numbers alone, completely disregarding what God had done for them.
Yeah.
And it's completely contrast to how trusting he was when he defeated Goliath. Here, a small boy, a fraction of his size, unarmed, unarmored, armed with nothing but a slingshot and 5 smooth stones. His faith in God was so strong he was willing to go toe-to-toe with this monster, trusting in God.
And so why did he lose his faith? Because really his relationship was much, much closer. His faith should have been so strong. He had his own Gad, his own prophet. He'd had all these relationships. He had seen miracle after miracle in his life.
I don't know. We don't know what his relationship was with God, but as he gets older and as he's accumulating these concubines, it makes me think that was not what God wanted. God has intended us to be one man and one woman together. That's the ideal. That's the best, most cohesive, where you're going to find the most happiness, and it's just the way we're designed to work. And by David going outside of those things, and that's just the one thing that we see that's in the text. There must have been many other things. And we have the census. We just start to see David. It's kind of a decline. I don't believe that he ever left God, but I think he just got tired. He just got tired, and all of the weight of Israel and the difficulties and all of the regrets that he had in the past that kind of took away his credibility, and he would have been embarrassed to go out into public after what he had done, and he just lost that authority that he once had. I don't know. I don't know why the 70,000 Israelites had to die. But it's interesting the decision that David made. What were the choices that were given him?
Oh, I forgot. 3 more years of drought. 3 weeks or 3 months of. I'm sorry. I have to say. I read this like a week and a half ago. I don't remember the exact.
A long drought.
Yeah.
Was one choice. There was basically being defeated and enslaved by his enemies for a time.
Yeah.
And then the third was the destroying. Was it the plagues, the destroying angel? And it was interesting. So David chose. Why did he choose the latter?
I think it's because it was as short as possible.
I think it was short. Maybe that was what it was. I also think that it was. He knew God was merciful, and he knew that he would rather put his fate and be judged by God than the Philistines or the 3 years of the plague, which would have put him in very unfavorable light with the people. Can you imagine 3 years of famine and the complaining and there's a good chance that they would have came and tore him from the castle and destroyed him.
I think too, he with a shorter reign of punishment, he only has to live through that much punishment. Where 3 years, like every day, this is my fault, this is my fault, this is my fault. Where 3 weeks, you can get through 3 weeks.
Yeah. Well, he didn't have to be punished though, but the 70,000 did.
Well, I'm sure he was guilt-ridden.
So we get back to, does God have favorites? Is he sure let David slide on a few things, didn't he?
Well, it's not like he had a lovely life.
A good point that was brought up in the comments that I don't think we covered last time, that we'll close with this, is that God, we talk about being bound by a covenant, being bound by a promise. God bound himself to David with the promise of Christ coming through his line. And so he couldn't very well destroy David. By destroying David, he would have broken his promise of the Messiah.
And he keeps his promises.
Keeps his promises. So that covenant, God was always aware of, and I think by and large, we don't know. We don't know the reasons, but I think it played an important factor. It seems to me anyway. The reason why David continued to not to have to pay for the things that he had done, because there was a promise that needed to be kept. I don't know. Well, interesting. All right, so what's next week?
Kings, first book of Kings.
Are we going to split this up into two? These big Old Testament
yes,
epics?
we are. We're going to split it.
So what's the reading assignment will be First Kings. We're going to read up to what chapter?
There are, looks like there are 22. So we'll read 1 through 11.
1 through 11.
Yeah.
Okay. Heart Racer.
You can say that?
Yes. Let's see. Everybody likes to see the Heart Racer. She's the sweetest thing. She sits on Mrs. W's lap on every Bible study. This is a prairie dog here. I've been teaching her. What, you ready, Sora, for it? Can you do the prairie dog? Oh no.
Just let me just get back on her lap.
All right, let's close in prayer. Dear Father, we thank you for this opportunity to study your word. I pray for all of those that are in attendance for the Bible study, that you bring peace and look after them and honor your promises, that you know what we have need of before we even ask. Help us to let nothing prevent us from doing the Bible study next week, and be with us. Give us wisdom as we read and study, and help us to see what your true character is like. I ask these blessings in Jesus' name. Amen.